Jesi milostivi čovekoljubiv Bog i tebi slavu uznosimo, Otcu i Sinu i Svetome Duhu, sada i u vekove vekova.
In a world of shadows and secrets untold, where primeval stories make the brave go cold, mighty gods are high and realms below, whispers of legends that shape each soul. And nightmarish dreams, cryptids lurking, nothing's as it seems, giants walking, angels and demons fight, only truth can bring the light. Through the echoes of time the tales unfold, mysteries arise as the prophecies are foretold, from valiant knights to buried treasure, this podcast brings nothing but pleasure. Welcome to Mysteries of Majesty. With us, don't be a travesty. Theology, mythology, fantasy, and horror. Dungeons and dragons, Skyrim and Mordor. Phantom powers haunt the evening in gothic castles where they're screaming. Wizards cast spells in their towers tonight, exploiting enigmas hidden from our sight. Archaeologists make excavations deep of the ancient tombs where pharaohs sleep. In the dust of ages we chronicles keep, storytelling's power of monsters that creep. Mysteries and Majesty is the place for you to learn about this haunted space. From scholarship to manuscripts of old, unlock the secrets of wisdom and gold.
Blessed Sunday, everyone. Welcome to the last episode for this year, 2024. The episode number is 114, and I'm very glad and thankful to Amber that she found energy and time in her busy schedule, recovering from school and 101 podcasts in between, that she found time to join with us for tonight in the best crossover in the history of the universe. Yes, better even than Marvel universe. Namely, we'll be talking about Moses, Plato, and Tolkien tonight. And if you're thinking like, what? Yes, we'll be talking about theology, history, philosophy, fiction, fantasy, all of these things, and trying to put them together, spiced up with some Dr. Heiser's material. And of course, we can't go without that. So be ready to hear an episode and a theme that I say, and I try to say this humbly, you won't hear on other places, because not everyone is willing to cover all of this in a great length and in a long episode that we plan to do for tonight. So that being said, I think this will be a really fun and interesting episode. If you like notes, take your notebooks. If you like typing on your phone or computer, be ready to do that. We plan to cover a lot of stuff and try to connect them, bring parallels. But also try to understand the differences between, again, Moses, Plato, and Tolkien. Before we start diving, and we'll start with Tolkien's Silmarillion and his creation. Amber, why do you think this topic is very important for us as Christians and in general for the audience? What do you think we can learn from tonight's episode?
Yeah, thanks, Nico, for having me on. This was a really fun idea to mash these topics together. That was really fun. This was a fun idea. I think this is really important for a couple of reasons. I think that, one, we've lost, it feels like a little bit of a sense of wonder of beauty, and how there's so much beauty reflected in creation, and how that has even some, one could argue, has some healing properties with it, and this idea of beauty, and it being woven into creation itself. And when we get to see that played out in things like Tolkien's work or in Plato's trying to describe, things that are reflected in Genesis 1, I think it kind of helps us make connections to see the image reflected in the beauty of us as images of God in everything that is created, no matter where it comes from. As images of God, everything that we create touches on that idea, and the idea of the creator comes through it. So we can find that beauty everywhere. And I think it's important too, because when you bring in, and we'll bring in a little bit the works of Michael Heiser, and trying to understand in a way that maybe we're not quite used to in our Western mind, into understanding the ancient mind and the ancient Near East mind specifically, can really give you a different perspective on both the Old Testament, well, the whole Bible, and also Plato himself. I mean, so there's ways in trying to understand the way that each of those thinkers is coming at this subject, which is very different. We can really get the whole picture of the entire idea that they're discussing, and not just get the YouTube short 20-second version of the idea, which you miss a lot of the overlaps and the complexity and the ideas that are being conveyed here. So yeah.
I honestly think, based on all the sources and material we compiled tonight, I think that if someone will use this material in I don't know about church setting and Sunday school, but let's say if a church has a book club, or if a professor or a teacher in a school wanna teach their kids something new, I believe that the material we composed and gathered can be easily taught for a week. And I mean every day of the week, not whole day, but at least one class every day of the week, I think. So whatever we plan to read and comment on tonight, I hope, guys, people, the audience, won't think like this is everything. We'll try to cover a lot, but it's certainly not everything. Yeah, that being said, let's start with Silmarillion. So we'll be reading the first chapter of Tolkien's masterpiece. This is his Genesis, how Tolkien envisioned to be his universe, how it would look like. It's about 7 pages, so I'll try to read at least 3 or 4, and then Amber will join me. And then, I mean, we don't have to read the book of Genesis. I would assume that most of the audience have read at least once in their lifetime. If you didn't, you need literally 1 or 2 minutes to read. It's a very short chapter. Let's say a couple of minutes, okay? So our plan is to analyze the work first of Tolkien and then Plato, and see so many similarities when it comes to the origin of everything: space, planet, humankind, and also how our spiritual beings or entities involved in our reality. So we are just piling up all of this together. Okay, the music of the Ainur. And I apologize for all those Tolkien fans. I'm not the Tolkien scholar. If I butcher some names, it is what it is, because he's inventing, the guy invented the whole Elvish language and all these names. So I'll give my best. There was Eru, the one, who in Arda is called Ilúvatar. And he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. But for a long while they sang only each alone, or but few together, while the rest hearkened. For each comprehended only that part of the mind of Ilúvatar from which he came, and in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly. Yet ever as they listened, they came to deeper understanding and increased in unison and harmony. And it came to pass that Ilúvatar called together all the Ainur and declared to them a mighty theme, unfolding to them things greater and more wonderful than he had yet revealed. And the glory of its beginning and the splendor of its end amazed the Ainur. So they bowed before Ilúvatar and were silent. Then Ilúvatar said to them, "Of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that ye make in harmony together a great music. And since I have kindled you with a flame imperishable, ye shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with its own thoughts and devices, if he will. But I will sit and hearken, and be glad that through your great beauty has been wakened into song. Then the voices of the Ainur, unto harps and lutes and pipes and trumpets and viols and organs, and like unto countless choirs singing with words, began to fashion the theme of Iluvatar to a great music. And a sound arose of endless interchanging melodies, woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing into the depths and into the heights. And the places of the dwelling of Iluvatar were filled to overflowing, and the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. Just have to stop here for a second, just say how much I love this. It's so poetic. Okay. Never since have the Ainur made any music like to this music. Though it has been great, it has been said that a greater still shall be made before Iluvatar by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Iluvatar after the end of days. Then the themes of Iluvatar shall be played aright, and take being in the moment of their utterance. For all shall then understand fully his intent in their part, and each shall know the comprehension of each. And Iluvatar shall give to their thoughts the secret fire, being well pleased. I hope by now that the audience has understood that Iluvatar is God and Ainur are the sons of God, or the angelic beings. But now Iluvatar sat and hearkened, and for a great while it seemed good to him, for in the music there were no flaws. But as the theme progressed, it came into the heart of Melkor to interweave matters of his own imaging that were not in accord with the theme of Iluvatar. For he sought therein to increase the power and glory of the part assigned to himself. To Melkor, among the Ainur, had been given the greatest gifts of power and knowledge, and he had a share in all the gifts of his brethren. He had gone often alone into the void places, seeking the imperishable flame, for desire grew hot within him to bring into being things of his own, and it seemed to him that Iluvatar took no thought for the void, and he was impatient of its emptiness. Yet he found not the fire, for it is with Iluvatar. But being alone, he had begun to conceive thoughts of his own, unlike those of his brethren. And I know by now the audience can assume who is Melkor. Some of these thoughts he now wove into his music, and straightway discord arose about him. And many that sang nigh him grew despondent, and their thought was disturbed, and their music faltered. And some began to attune their music to his rather than to the thought which they had at first. Then the discord of Melkor spread over wider, and the melodies which had been heard before foundered in a sea of turbulent sound. But Iluvatar sat and hearkened until it seemed that about his throne there was a raging storm, as of dark waters that made war one upon another in an endless wrath that would not be, how do you read this word? Assuaged?
Assuaged, yeah.
Okay, assuaged. Then Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that he smiled, and he lifted up his left hand, and a new theme began amid the storm. I love this. How God smiles. There's no chaos problem for him. He's in charge of everything, and there can be music in the middle of chaos and all the turbulence. For us, it's scary, but for him, it's like, no, the music continues but now we're playing. Now you'll be listening my music, how I play.
Right.
So yeah, and a new theme began amid the storm, like and yet unlike to the former theme, and it gathered power and had new beauty. But the discord of Melkor rose in uproar and contended with it. And again there was a war of sound more violent than before, until many of the Ainur were dismayed and sang no longer, and Melkor had the mastery. Then again Iluvatar arose, and the Ainur perceived that his countenance was stern, and he lifted up his right hand, and behold, a third theme grew amid the confusion, and it was unlike the others. For it seemed at first soft and sweet, a mere rippling of gentle sounds in delicate melodies. But it could not be quenched, and it took to itself power and profundity. And it seemed at last that there were two musics progressing at one time before the seat of Iluvatar, and they were utterly at variance. It was like a war of music, war of who
Mhm.
will, whose sound, whose voice will be heard, and if Melkor can take the supreme and sovereign seat of Iluvatar. The one was deep and wide and beautiful, but slow and blended with an immeasurable sorrow, from which its beauty chiefly came. The other had now achieved a unity of its own, but it was loud and vain and endlessly repeated, and it had little harmony, but rather a clamorous unison, as of many trumpets braying upon a few notes. And it essayed to drown the other music by the violence of its voice. But it seemed that its most triumphant notes were taken by the other and woven into its own solemn pattern. In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Iluvatar shook and a tremor ran out into the silences, yet unmoved, Iluvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both his hands, and in one chord, is it chord or chord?
It's chord. Chord.
And in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, piercing as the light of the eye of Iluvatar, the music ceased. Then Iluvatar spoke, and he said, "Mighty are the Ainur, the mightiest among them is Melkor. But that he may know, and all the Ainur, that I am Iluvatar. Those things that ye have sung, I will show them forth, that ye may see what ye have done. And thou, Melkor, shall see that no theme may be played that had not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite. For he that attempted this shall prove but mine instrument in the devising of things more wonderful, which he himself had not imagined." Then the Ainur were afraid, and they did not yet comprehend the words that were said to them. And Melkor was filled with shame, of which came secret anger. But Iluvatar arose in splendor, and he went forth from the fair regions that he had made for the Ainur, and the Ainur followed him. But then when they were come into the void, Iluvatar said to them, "Behold your music." And he showed to them a vision, giving to them sight where before was only hearing, and they saw a new world made visible before them. And it was globed amid the void, and it was sustained therein, but was not of it. And as they looked and wondered, this world began to unfold its history, and it seemed to them that it lived and grew. And when the Ainur had gazed for a while and were silent, Iluvatar said again, "Behold your music. This is your minstrelsy, and each of you shall find contained herein, amid the design that I set before you. all those things which it may seem that he himself devised or added. And thou, Melkor, wilt discover all the secret thoughts of thy mind, and wilt perceive that they are but a part of the whole and tributary to its glory. Amber, do you mind continuing, please?
Okay, yeah, no, that's fine. And many other things Iluvatar spoke to the Ainur at that time. And because of their memory of his words and the knowledge that each has of the music that he himself made, the Ainur knew much of what was and is to come, and few things are unseen by them. Yet some things there are they cannot see, neither alone nor taking counsel together. For to none but himself has Iluvatar revealed all that he has in store, and in every age there can come forth things that are new and have no foretelling, for they do not proceed from the past. And so it was that this vision of the world has played before them. The Ainur saw that it contained things which they had not thought, and they saw with amazement the coming of the children of Iluvatar and the habitation that was prepared for them. And they perceived that they themselves, in the labor of their music, had been busy with the preparation of this dwelling, and yet knew not that it had any purpose beyond its own beauty. For the children of Iluvatar were conceived by him alone, and they came with the third theme, and were not in the theme which Iluvatar propounded at the beginning, and none of the Ainur had part in their making. Therefore, when they beheld them, the more they did, they loved them, being things other than themselves, strange and free, wherein they saw the mind of Iluvatar reflected anew, and learned yet a little more of his wisdom, which otherwise had been hidden even from the Ainur. Yeah, go ahead and scroll that all the way up a little bit more. There you go. Now the children of Iluvatar are elves and men, the firstborn and the followers. And amid all the splendors of the world, its vast halls and spaces, and its wielding fires, Iluvatar chose a place for their habitation in the deeps of time and in the midst of the innumerable stars. And this habitation might seem a little thing to those who consider only the majesty of the Ainur and not their terrible sharpness, as who should take the whole field of Arda from the foundation of a pillar and so raise it until the cone of its summit were more bitter than a needle, or who consider only the immeasurable vastness of the world, which still the Ainur are shaping, and not the minute precision to which they shape all things therein. But when the Ainur had beheld this habitation in a vision, and had seen the children of Iluvatar arise therein, then many of the most mighty among them bent all their thought and their desire towards that place. And of these Melkor was chief, even as he was in the beginning, the greatest of the Ainur, who took part in the music. And he feigned, even to himself at first, that he desired to go thither and order all things for the good of the children of Iluvatar, controlling the turmoils of the heat and the cold that had come to pass through him. But he desired rather to subdue to his will both elves and men, envying the gifts with which Iluvatar promised to endow them, and he wished himself to have subjects and servants, and to be called Lord, and to be a master over the other wills. But the other Ainur looked upon this habitation set within the vast spaces of the world, which the elves called Arda, the earth, and their hearts rejoiced in light, and their eyes beheld many colors, were filled with gladness. But because of the roaring of the seas, they felt a great unquiet. And they observed the winds and the air, and the matters of which Arda was made, of iron and stone, and silver and gold, and many substances. But of all these, water they most greatly praised. And it is said by the Eldar that in water there lives yet the echo of the music of Ainur, more than in any substance else that is in earth. And many of the children of Iluvatar hearken, still unsated, to the voices of the sea, and yet know not for what they listen.
I can continue, don't worry.
Okay.
Thank you. Now to water had that Ainu, whom the elves call Ulmo, turned his thought, and of all most deeply was he instructed by Iluvatar in music. But of the airs and winds Manwe most had pondered, who is the noblest of the Ainur. Of the fabric of earth had Aule or Aul taught, to whom Iluvatar had given skill and knowledge, scarce less than to Melkor. But the delight and pride of Aul is in the deed of making, and in the thing made, and neither in possession nor in his own mastery. Wherefore he gives and hoards not, and is free from care, passing ever on to some new work. And Iluvatar spoke to Ulmo and said, seest thou now how here in this little realm, in the deeps of time, Melkor hath made war upon thy province. He had bethought him of bitter cold immoderate, and yet had not destroyed the beauty of thy fountains, nor of thy clear pools. Behold the snow and the cunning work of frost. Melkor had devised heats and fire without restraint, and had not dried up thy desire, nor utterly quelled the music of the sea. Behold rather the height and glory of the clouds, and the ever-changing mists, mists, and listen to the fall of rain upon the earth. And in these clouds thou art drawn near to Manwe, thy friend, whom thou lovest.
Yeah, lovest.
Then Umo answered, truly water is become now fairer than my heart imagined. Neither had my secret thought conceived the snowflake, nor in all my music was contained the falling of the rain. I will seek Manwe, that he and I may make melodies forever to thy delight. And Manwe and Ulmo have from the beginning been allied, and in all things have served most faithfully the purpose of Iluvatar. We're almost done.
Mhm.
But even as Ulmo spoke, and while the Ainur were yet gazing upon this vision, it was taken away the hidden from their sight. And it seemed to them that in that moment they perceived a new thing, darkness, which they had not known before except in thought. But they had become, how do you pronounce this, enamored?
Enamored, yeah.
Okay, of the beauty of the vision and engrossed in the unfolding of the world which came there to being, and their minds were filled with it. For the history was incomplete and the circles of time not full wrought when the vision was taken away. And some have said that the vision ceased ere the fulfillment of the dominion of man and the fading of the firstborn, wherefore, though the music is over all, the Valar have not seen as with sight the later ages or the ending of the world. Then there was unrest among the Ainur, but Iluvatar called to them and said, I know the desire of your minds, and what ye have seen should verily be, not only in your thought, but even as ye yourselves are, and yet other. Therefore I say, let the things be, and I will send forth into the void the flame imperishable, and it shall be at the heart of the world, and the world shall be. And those of you that will may go down into it. And suddenly the Ainur saw far off a light, as it were a cloud with a living heart of flame. And they knew that this was no vision only, but that Iluvatar had made a new things, the world that is. Thus it came to pass that of the Ainur some abode still with Iluvatar beyond the confines of the world, but others, and among them many of the greatest and most fair, took the leave of Iluvatar and descended unto it. But this condition Iluvatar made, or it is the necessity of their love, that their power should thenceforward be contained and bounded into the world, to be within it forever. until it is complete, so that they are its life and it is theirs. And therefore they are named the Valar, the powers of the world. But when the Valar enter into Ea, or the earth, they were at first astounded at a loss, for it was as it naught was yet made which they had seen in vision, and all was but on point to begin and yet unshaped, and it was dark. For the great music had been but the growth and flowering of thought in the timeless halls, and the vision only a foreshowing. But now they had entered in at the beginning of time. This is so cool. They had just entered in the beginning of time. And the Valar perceived that the world had been but foreshadowed and foresung, and they must achieve it. So began their great labors in wastes unmeasured and unexplored, and in ages uncounted and forgotten, until in the deeps of time and in the midst of the vast halls of Ea, there came to be that hour and that place where was made the habitation of the children of Iluvatar. And in this work, the chief part was taken by Manwe and Aule and Ulmo. But Melkor too there, but Melkor too was there from the first, and he meddled in all that was done, turning it, if he might, to his own desires and purposes. And he kindled great fires. When therefore earth was yet young and full of flame, Melkor coveted it, and he said to the other Valar, "This shall be my own kingdom, and I name it unto myself." Folks, this is the beginning of the name and claim heresy.
Mhm.
But Manwe was but Manwe was the brother of Melkor in the mind of Iluvatar, and he was the chief instrument of the second theme that Iluvatar had raised up against the discord of Melkor. For he called unto himself many spirits, both greater and less. And they came down into the fields of Arda and aided Manwe, lest Melkor should hinder the fulfillment of their labor forever, and earth should wither ere it flowered. And Manwe said unto Melkor, "This kingdom thou shalt not take for thine own wrongfully, for many others have labored here no less than thou." And there was strife between Melkor and the other Valar. And for that time Melkor withdrew and departed to other regions and did there what he would, but he did not put the desire of the kingdom of Arda from his heart. Now the Valar took to themselves shape and hue, and because they were drawn into the world by love of the children of Iluvatar, for whom they hoped, they took shape after their manner which they had beheld in the vision of Iluvatar, save only in majesty and splendor. Moreover, their shape comes of their knowledge of the visible world rather than of the world itself. And they need it not, save only as we use raiment. And yet we may be naked and suffer no loss of our being. Therefore the Valar may walk, if they will, unclad, and then even the Eldar cannot clearly perceive them, though they be present. But when they desire to clothe themselves, the Valar take upon them forms, some as of male and some as of female. For that difference of temper they had even from their beginning, and it is but bodied forth in the choice of each, not made by the choice, even as with us male and female may be shown by the raiment, but is not made thereby. But the shapes wherein the great ones array themselves are not at all times like to the shapes of the kings and queens of the children of Iluvatar. For at times they made clothe themselves in their own thought, made visible in forms and of majesty and dread. Let me just see how much. Okay,
We're
so
almost done.
paragraphs. Okay. And the Valar drew unto them many companions, some less, some well nigh as great as themselves. And they labored together in the ordering of the earth and the curbing of its, how do you pronounce this? Tumults?
Tolmuts, yeah, Tolmuts.
Okay. Then Melkor saw what was done, and that the Valar walked on earth as powers visible, clad in the raiment of the world, and were lovely and glorious to see, and blissful. And then the earth was becoming as a garden for their delight, for its turmoils were subdued. His envy grew. His envy grew then the greater within him, and he also took visible form. But because of his mood and the malice that burned in him, that form was dark and terrible. And he descended upon Arda in power and majesty, greater than any other of the Valar. And as a mountain that wades in the sea and has its head above the clouds, and is clad in ice and crowned with smoke and fire. And the light of the eyes of Melkor was like a flame that withers with heat and pierces with a deadly cold. Thus began the first battle of the Valar with Melkor for the dominion of Arda. And of those tumults, the elves know but little, for what has here been declared as come from the Valar themselves, with whom the Eldalis spoke in the land of Valinor, and by whom they were instructed. But little would the Valar ever tell of the wars before the coming of the elves. Yet it is told among the Eldar that the Valar endeavored ever, in despite of Melkor, to rule the earth and to prepare it for the coming of the firstborn. And they built lands, and Melkor destroyed them. Valleys they delved, and Melkor raised them up. Mountains they carved, and Melkor threw them down. Seas they hollowed, and Melkor spilled them. And naught might have peace or come to lasting growth, for surely as the Valar began a labor, so would Melkor undo it or corrupt it. And yet their labor was not all in vain. And though nowhere and in no work was their will and purpose wholly fulfilled, and all things were in hue and shape other than the Valar had at first intended, slowly nonetheless the earth was fashioned and made firm. And thus was the habitation of the children of Iluvatar established at the last in the deeps of time and amidst the immeasurable stars. By the way, all the links are provided in the sources that we're using are provided in the links description, so you can study for yourself. Okay, I plan soon to share a scholarly comparison analysis between the Book of Genesis and what we read. Before I do this, I need just shortly break. So maybe Amber, if you
Okay.
want to comment on what we read so far, how do you understand the first chapter of Tolkien's masterpiece?
Okay. Well, first, I want to just take a second to explain the players so we kind of can get our heads around what is going on here by understanding who's involved. So you have Eru, who is also called Iluvatar. Eru is in Tolkien's Elven language. I can't remember which one because he had like 4 or 5. But it means the one, and Iluvatar means all father. So he's making very clear with the names, the same as you see in scripture. The name helps us understand that this is one. There's one deity in charge here, right? And then he mentions the Ainur, which the Ainur are. Let me see. Let me get my notes out here because I need to. Okay.
Yeah, I think they're either angels or archangels.
Well, okay. Though the Ainur are there's layers. Okay, so you have the Ainur, which are there's the Valar and the Maiar, and then so the Ainur are what we're going to get into later with Heiser as the divine council, which is the little e Elohim that sit on the council, and then you get what are called the Maiar, which are the helpers or the servants of the Valar So that's going to be Sauron is a Maiar, Gandalf is a Maiar. There's several of them. I just can't remember off the top of my head. There's a bigger list than that, but those are the two that people are going to be most familiar with. Sauron is a Maiar. He is the student to Melkor, whose name is Morgoth. So Melkor and Sauron are different. Melkor is the primary, and Sauron is his understudy. So that's how those two are related. Okay, so excuse me. So, and then you've got, when you start talking about the children of Iluvatar, the first children of Iluvatar, those are the elves, which in Tolkien's mind are equivalent with the angels, which are different level than the divine council, little e Elohim. So there's a little bit of a hierarchical structure going on here. And then there's the second children of Iluvatar, which are equated with men, with humans. So the angels come first and then men in the order of creation here. So, and yeah, I think that should give us a little bit of a better footing as to trying to understand what's happening and who's playing what part in all of the creation language and stuff that we just heard in that chapter. So, yeah, I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, and that blends well with the article I have prepared. If I just learn how to share this, so I'll need your guidance. Can you see the PDF I opened, the Myth of Creation?
Yeah, I can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so that means everyone can see it. Okay. So this is a phenomenal, lengthy 42 pages PDF, which of course we will not read in its entirety. It's publicly available. Everything I found was publicly available, for tonight. And this is from Academia EDU. Is from this, I think she's a scholar, Martina Juričková. And she titled her paper "The Myth of Creation in Tolkien's The Silmarillion." And I'll just plug in my laptop before we start so that we won't suddenly go offline in the middle of the episode. It's a phenomenal paper and explains what you just mentioned, but she even goes more. We don't have to start here because she just gives the intro. Okay. So I'll try to read as much as I can, but for the rest, I would just encourage audience to download this PDF and study for themselves. I would like to focus on some of the Christian motives that are present in his work, Tolkien's work, particularly in the book The Silmarillion, and especially in its first chapters, Ainulindale and Valaquenta, which I think it's the second one, which we did not cover today because we'll need days and weeks to cover everything in detail.
Right.
In which the biblical allusions are doubtlessly intentionally the most explicit. These two chapters describe how the world from Tolkien's fantasy universe was created at the beginning by Eru Iluvatar, the greatest divine being who rules over everything, in a way very similar to the story of creation as provided in the book Genesis in the Bible. So Tolkien, even in his work, he dared to mingle the Bible with some elements of pagan mythologies. Here I focus on 5 key elements present in both stories: the person of the creator, the process of creation as such, the spiritual super beings, the evil, and the created children of the God figure. Okay, let's begin. I'm glad we're skipping all of this. Okay, the most crucial term in the statement is reality, quote unquote, which Tolkien understood to be the principal Christian truth, the story of Jesus Christ. He called this story the true myth because it describes a real historical event, but at the same time, it embraces all the essence of fairy stories and the qualities of written art, as it is indeed a piece of literature. And all the other myths, religions, and pagan as well complement to it, as in them, quote unquote, God expressed himself through the minds of poets, using the images of their mythopoeia to reveal the fragments of his eternal truth. The opening chapter of the Silmarillion is called Ainulindale, the music of the Ainur, which is the most significant part of all Tolkien's work in terms of relation to Christian teaching. This chapter describes how the world, in Elvish called Ea, was created by Ilúvatar, first in thoughts, in the great music, and then physically with the help of Valar. Its likeness to Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament, is evident. So let's talk a little bit about the creator. Within the first chapter, it is obvious that Eru, the One, also called Ilúvatar, is identified with a Christian God. The meaning of name Eru is the One, or he that is alone. And actually, God in the Bible often refers to himself as the only one, and he is believed to be the truest one, and there exists no other God except him. Both of them, Eru and God, reside above the circles of the world, not on the earth, that cannot be reached by any creature alive. Tolkien mentions that Ainur, the saint spirits, lived in Ilúvatar's house with him. Considering Eru Ilúvatar to be the same as God, it can be also said that they lived in God's house, what is another term used for the heaven. But before the creation of the Ainur, Eru lived there on his own, as well as God lived on his own before he created the angels. As for the second name, Ilúvatar, it means the father of all, what is again similar to the perception of Christian God. In most of the Christian prayers, God is called our Father according to Jesus' teaching, and he is the creator who gave existence to everything. Eru planned the creating of the world and all its inhabitants in his music, and then laid its foundation in the void where there was nothing to make it of. Also, God made the world out of nothing because he's the ultimate source of everything. Yet Eru is perceived as father mostly by the Ainur, who lived with him at the beginning of the world and not by all other creatures. So, okay, we here see the difference in biblical God, who is more personal with people than with Ilúvatar from Tolkien's universe. Eru has never been seen by anyone alive except by the Ainur, which is the same as we read in the Bible, that no one has seen God, and we know later except Jesus. The only difference, when it comes to human eye, of course, the angels saw God the Father since they were made. The only difference between these two gods, the Christian one and that of Middle Earth, is that Tolkien's Eru seems to become rather a passive god, whereas the Christian God often intervenes in the happenings of the earth and reveals himself throughout the history. After the great music and the initial act of creation, Eru somehow recedes from the doings on Arda, the earth, and remains only a memory of the Ainur. Though the life on earth is not easy, but just the opposite, it is full of troubles. He never helps its inhabitants directly nor via any advice. In the next chapters of Silmarillion, he seems not to pay any attention to his creatures at all. I'll add that sad. Even if he knew what was going on in there. So this is almost like God of deism. I made the earth and now I'm going to distance myself, so it's up to you what happens next. He's a mere observer. And in the other Tolkien's works, which describe later events from the point of view of Middle Earth's history, like Akalabeth or The Lord of the Rings, he seems he totally vanished. He's not mentioned there at all. And that is an absolute contradiction with the image of God, who knows everything and always helps those who call him. However, Tolkien's Eru has not completely ceased from the later history of Middle Earth, and it may seem on the first sight or reading. After a closer inspection, we may realize that he's still intervening in the happenings of the world, not only directly and visibly, but in the forms of providence, mystical coincidences, and consequences which often cannot be explained by reason. It is because Tolkien purposefully withdraws all explicit religious references from his later works as if to prove his point that even pagan understand this as not the one God believers. And that's how pagan are understood, not the one God believers, as even their mythology can reveal God's existence. Eru needs to be explicitly present and actively involved at the beginning of the Silmarillion, as there could is there could be no creation without the God. But the more the history of Middle Earth becomes the history of his children, elves, and men, the less evident his presence is. Similarly, the Christian God is very actively influencing the course of history during the time span captured in the Bible, if not directly by miracles, so at least by speaking through various prophets. Yet the same can be longer be said about the centuries to follow after the events described in the Bible. As Christians believe, he did not abandon his creation, only his existence is nowadays not manifested so explicitly. Thus, Tolkien's Eru in the Second Age and onwards is much like the Christian God in our millennia, acting discreetly as the providence. That was God. What about creation? Another similarity to the Bible can be noticed. Well, first, would you like to comment on this, or you're good?
But I would only say to push back a little bit on what she said is and what they said. We do have a couple of instances where Eru does intervene in the Second and Third Age. In the Second Age, during the all of the mess that is going on in Numenor, when Ar-Pharazôn usurps the authority of the actual rightful monarch, the king of Numenor, Eru intervenes and just sinks the whole island to just wipe them out. So there is some imagery that ties to like the former prophets, books of like Joshua, Judges, like some of those ideas of the overthrow of some of the neighboring nations. So there is that reference there. Eru himself sends Gandalf back to Middle Earth as Gandalf the White towards the end of the Lord of the Rings books. And then Tolkien, in one of his letters, I didn't get a chance to look that up, but there's a book, The Letters of Tolkien, which he talks a lot about his characters and his developments and stuff. And I didn't realize it was going to come up. Otherwise, I would have sent you the link for that. But it's a fantastic book, great to understand Tolkien. But in one of those letters, Tolkien mentions that at the end of the Third Age, he was involved in causing Gollum to trip and fall into the fires of Mount Doom while holding the One Ring. So that Eru was involved in that as well as Gollum and Frodo are wrestling over the ring, and Gollum wins and gets it, and he trips and falls into the lake of fire. That Tolkien is saying that Eru was involved in that as well. So those would be the three instances I think I would push back and say he doesn't disappear completely. He does intervene in major ways in the story. It just is very selective and very subtle in the way that we would understand, I guess, providence, but it's not a complete disappearing. So that would be my only pushback on her.
Okay, cool. So like in the Bible, God doesn't show up every day and does some great miracles. We see great miracles usually with Moses, with Elijah, with Jesus, but in between, it's not like every day or month. So then your context helps us to see that actually Tolkien's vision of God is not that different from biblical.
Right. It is not. I think Tolkien had a very good understanding of the overall what we call biblical theology, the narrative of the story tapestry that's being painted in especially the Old Testament, but in the Bible itself as a whole. I think Tolkien as a storyteller really understood that in a way that I don't think we're just starting to understand when we're digging into canonical narrative and learning how to read the Bible as literature. We are starting to catch up to Tolkien now, finally, I think.
Cool. Okay, thank you for that. Another similarity to the Bible can be noticed within the scene of the creation of the world. Eru gave existence to it, saying, "Ea, let these things be." This exclamation resembles God's work, "Let there be light." Moreover, in both cases, the earth was made at the very beginning. It was exactly this moment when Eru spoke. In the Silmarillion, the light already existed, but only in Iluvatar's house, while the earth was placed outside it in the void and dark. See, This is cool because in at the very beginning, in the first few verses of Genesis 1, when it says that God created light, and you would assume it's sun, but then later it says that God created, stars and planets, including moon and sun. And you're like, well, what type of light is it mentioned at the beginning of Genesis? But here, even though it's poetic and even though it's fiction and myth, right? But this is actually to me at least, a profound explanation that in the Silmarillion, the light already existed, but only in Iluvatar's
Mhm.
house. For me, this is beautiful. And I don't know how much is theological or biblical, but it helps me to understand the difference between that
Right.
original light and the light that was made later that was like helping us to observe day and
Mhm.
night festivals and everything else.
Right.
Actually, when Eru spoke the words of origination, it was the only time he spoke during the whole act of creation, whereas God continued and spoke again, ordering the firmament to appear, the waters to divide, the plants to grow, stars to rise, beasts to live, and many more times, almost in every line of the first chapter of Genesis. As for Eru, from this part of his role and importance within the development of the world diminishes, and Tolkien implements in some attributes of pagan mythologies. Even as a result of the labor of higher powers, he allows in certain degree its natural geological evolution. Okay, I see. But this is contrary to the Bible, which is highly symbolical regarding this. It is known that the number 7 had a great symbolic meaning for the Jews. It represented fullness, the fullness of time that had been present. Is this present or present? I don't know how you read this.
It has been preset.
Oh, preset. Okay, thanks for the shaping of the world. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien managed to interconnect all three visions of the world's beginning: the Christian, the pagan, and scientific. The word Ea means to be or let it be. The word was later adopted by Els as the name for the world. In this sense, its meaning slightly altered to it is, or the world that is. Taking into account that God names himself He that is, and that the whole creation, including the world, exists only because of his will and thanks to it, it can be also said that it is as he is, because he gave a part of himself into everything that he created, and therefore he is believed to be present in everything. Remember, does this sound a little bit like pantheism or panentheism? This section, this sentence, because God gave a part of himself into everything he made, he's present in everything.
No, I don't think so. I think this goes back to the idea of imprinting his image onto creation. It is the image of God that's given to man. It is because we'll get into this a little bit later, but is we see that in the ordering of chaos, the spirit
Mhm.
is hovering in everything. So the spirit, Holy Spirit is there intermingled in all of creation, and that's going to leave an impression. That's going to leave that imprint of the Trinitarian God in everything that was created. So I don't think so.
And when you say everything, you don't mean just humans and animals. You mean
Nope.
things like rocks, like soil, correct?
Yep. Yep.
Oh,
I mean everything in the physical world. Yep.
okay. Metaphorically, he's within everything, and everything is within him. So it can be also called the name Ea. It is the world that is. Furthermore, the Bible says the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Correspondingly, the world Ea did not have its current looks when it was created. When the Ainur saw it for the first time, it was shapeless and dark too. Its surface was dark and cold, hard and cold, just a piece of stone engulfed in fire, like the scientists described the appearance of Earth in its early years when it was being formed. In spite of the general likeness, the Ainulindale, so this first chapter of Silmarillion, is not simply a retelling of Genesis' story of creation. We just substituted names in different environments. and especially does not follow the chronological order of the stages of development of the world as they are described in the Bible. I don't want to go in that because I'm trying to save some time. They're just saying that Silmarillion is more complex, which is normal because the Bible is not trying to describe the things in the same order, and also Tolkien had more creativity and he could play with words. Okay, the secret fire. All things firstly originated in Iluvatar's mind and only later were given substantial form. This a little bit reminds me of Plato, and we'll turn to Plato a little bit later, but this is a fascinating sentence for me because I think this is perfectly aligning with Plato. So the creation of Ea is described in the following quote: Iluvatar gave to the vision being, and set it amid the void, and the secret fire was sent to burn at the heart of the world. One possible explanation of what the secret fire was may be that it just represents the earth core, which is also some kind of fire consistent of fiery magma and molten rocks. It would go if there was not written that the secret fire was sent. Logically, this collocation that evokes that the secret fire is something alive when it can be sent. This knowledge directs us to a spiritual and religious interpretation. The secret fire may then represent the Holy Spirit, the third person of God that often appears in the form of fire flame, which we see in Acts 2. Tolkien also uses another name for the secret fire, that is the fire imperishable. I love that, the fire imperishable, to express his eternal nature. He existed from the very beginning, even before the universe was made, and he is permanent as well as the Holy Spirit is. Also, the lamp always turned on that has to represent the flame of the Holy Spirit in the church is familiarly called the eternal light. What actually means the same as the fire imperishable, just in different words. For the fire is a source of light, and therefore the word fire may be substituted by word light as a, how do you pronounce this? Sinechdo?
Actually, I don't know because I don't know that word. Synodoke,
Yeah,
maybe.
I don't know. I think it's some form of speech, but I can't pronounce it. Okay. Likewise, elsewhere in the Silmarillion, it is stated that the secret fire is needed to give life to the created things. It burns in them then, and without it, the things would die. That is exactly the same doctrine like the one that the Christians have about the Holy Spirit. And it's funny because they mentioned Genesis 2:7, which, well, you actually talked about Genesis 1, where the Holy Spirit was hovering, but it's kind of same thing because there's no life without the Holy Spirit. I think I'm gonna skip this because again I'm trying to save time. Would you like to comment on this subsection of the Holy Spirit and secret fire, or do you want me to continue?
Mine would just be a point of order that I think she's made a little bit of, without getting into the Hebrew there, I think she's made a little bit of a comparison error because she's in Genesis 2 comparing the giving, that give of breath of life. That is nephesh, which is a different word from Holy Spirit, which is ruach, and those are two different things in Hebrew. So I would disagree with her on that because technically in Hebrew those are two different words that mean two different things, but I'm not going to squabble with her about that, really.
See, Amber, she was supposed to contact you and ask you for some advice or peer reviewed article, but not everyone knows Hebrew like you, so we have to be graceful. At least she has good intentions. So to summarize this subchapter on the Holy Spirit, the sound of the water is the last living echo of the great music in which the universe was pre-imagined and pre-created. The miracle of creation is present in it as some audible memory and gives the water divine characteristics. In this manner, it is then sacred too. The Ainur. They have the most important role in the forming of the world after Iluvatar, but their understanding is rather ambiguous. The first chapter of Tolkien's work, gives the first account of them already in its beginning lines. There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were first with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them themes of music, and they sang before him, and he was glad. And in one of his letters, Tolkien gives an exact explanation about what they were intended to be. So this is his quote: angelic powers whose function is to exercise delegated authority in their spheres of rule and government, not creation, making or remaking. They're divine, that is, were originally outside and existed before the making of the world. From these excerpts, I can't pronounce this word for the life of me. Excerpts.
Excerpts, yes.
Yeah, it can be plainly seen that the Ainur were also created by Iluvatar and that they accompanied him even before he decided to make the world. And Tolkien himself called them the Holy Ones by what he points out that they were saint or divine. This whole concept then very much resembles the Christian vision of angels. Although the Bible does not mention when the angels were created, they must have already existed before the events that are described in Genesis. There's a quote from Matthew 18:10. The task of angels, apart from the celebration of God, is to be his messengers. They appear several times in the Bible when they have some important message to reveal to people. And since they do not have the human limitations, they can act in his name and meditate his will. I guess I forgot to highlight the end of the sentence. The Ainur were directly asked by Iluvatar to join the great music and supplement it with their ideas. Several church fathers held an opinion that God used his angels as instruments in creating the physical world. Blah, blah, blah. We'll skip this. Actually, I like this part, but we'll try to save time and not read the church fathers. But the difference was in something else. The number of the Ainur who descended to Ea was 14, the kings and queens of the earth, which was consequently renamed to Arda, that means the realm, and signifies that it is now under their dominion. Very interesting for our divine council topic that is coming very soon. These 14 Ainur are since then called Valar, or the powers, and each of them had a special area of interest and power. Super interesting, when it comes to our later convo. Such organization reminds rather some chorus of pagan gods, like those of ancient Greek or Roman mythologies, than angels. There do exist some Christian theories that claim that some angels may also be specialized and assigned only to a certain task, area, or group of creatures. This idea was supported by St. John's vision, which is described in the book of Revelation as he writes, "Angel came out from the altar, which had power over fire," Revelation 14:18. However, according to how the Valar act and function, and how they are later perceived in Arda, they're closer to the ancient gods. Only that the ancient Greek and Roman gods often seem to be quite egoistic, malicious, I don't know how to pronounce this,
Leviatious,
and cruel, these all being rather negative and very human qualities. Peter Kreeft explains that the European pagan gods are usually half good and half bad, and their superiority over humankind is not due to their goodness, but only in power. In fact, in three powers: power over nature by a supernatural or magical technology, then power over ignorance, such as cleverness, farsight, and foresight, and power over death or immortality. On the other hand, Tolkien's Valar do not manifest their superiority by force and display predominantly positive qualities, such as countenance, mercy, and kindness. More of the kind as we would expect just yet strict gods to be. So possibly the Valar can be understood as an attempt to combine the Christian and pagan motives, giving the pagan gods a nicer and more humanistic face in the Christian image. Would you like to comment on this section of the Sons of God or Angels?
I think we'll get into this more when we get into Heiser's work, so I'll just not go into it twice. We'll just wait until we get to Heiser.
Okay. The Maiar are another kind of Ainur that are present in the Silmarillion. They're described as being lower, less mighty, and with smaller power than the Valar. And they interact with people much more easily. If we assume that the Ainur represent angels and use the Christian hierarchy to classify them, then the Maiar could be related to the ordinary angels, while the Ainur would feature some higher degree, probably archangels. Since this info about angels is easily accessible through the Bible and Google, I'll take my breath and skip this. Okay. Manven Tulkas, and I also don't think we have to spend too much time, but let's read one paragraph. Two most outstanding of the Valar were Manve and Varda. Manve is the mightiest of all of the Ainur and Iluvar's dearest. This sounds like Archangel Michael. He was chosen to administer Arda and is therefore called its king. This nickname would allude to Jesus Christ, who is the king of the earth and heaven. But having examined Manve's character more closely, we find out that he by no means represents Jesus. However, he has much in common with Saint Michael the Archangel. In Roman Catholicism, he is believed to be the mightiest of all angels, that is analogous to Manve's position among the Ainur. He is the greatest enemy of Melkor, who is the Silmarillion, who in the Silmarillion represents the devil, and it will be discussed later. Likewise, Michael's primary task is to fight the devil, and because of this, he's called the God's warrior. Skip this. Varda. As Tolkien asserted, her character was clearly related to Catholic devotion to Saint Mary, who had a big significance for Tolkien. He called her Our Lady, and his perception of her beauty, both in majesty and simplicity, was founded. In The Lord of the Rings, the Saint Mary was visualized by the character of Galadriel, and in the Silmarillion, she is doubtlessly represented by Varda. This resemblance is obvious for several reasons. First, Saint Mary is called the Queen of the World and Heaven, and Varda, the mightiest female Ainu, is similarly called the Queen of Arda. Saint Mary is often imagined as the most beautiful human being ever. I think this is too biased, but whatever. Because she was born without the original sin. Only according to the Catholics. And
Right.
Varda is also said to be of such beauty that it can be hardly described by any words of any existing language. Please, she's not God. She can be described, but whatever. In a like manner, as Saint Mary is asked to help by Christians, the elves invoke Varda when they are in struggle. An example of this is given in the song, and this is the short song. And later address her, the Queen of the Stars from Mount Everwhite. The names Alberet and Gilthoniel mean Star Queen, that what in relation with the exclamation Queen beyond the Western Seas is similar to the name of Saint Mary, Stella Maris, the Star of the Sea, which is derived from her function as a guiding star that has to lead those who wander and are lost back to God and to enlighten their journey. Lady Clear then refers to Mary's purity and virginity, and so on and so on. Okay, before we switch to Evel, any comment on Mary?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. The evil. The concept of evil is in the Silmarillion represented by Melkor, whose similarity to Satan is even greater than that between Eru and God. Melkor was the greatest of the Ainur, with a share in the powers of all the others of his kind. Originally, he was a brother of Manve in Iluvatar's mind, so Michael the Archangel. Likewise, Satan was the greatest and cleverest angel with power equal to Michael, until he was cast out of heaven because of his rebellion against God. And that is another similarity of these two. As it is generally believed, Satan was so proud of his big power that he soon became jealous of God. He did not want to serve him anymore. Instead, he wanted to usurp the whole world for himself. He did not want to worship God, but he desired to be worshipped himself. Then there's example from Isaiah 14. And he was joined by many lesser angels whom he was able to persuade. Similarly, Melkor revolted against Iluvatar. When he saw that the things pre-imagined in the great music were wonderful, they attracted him so much that he desired to own them all. to govern them and to be the king of the whole world instead of Ilúvatar. Like Satan, he did not want to participate in Ilúvatar's plan only as his mediator, but he was anxious to use his great power to create things of his own that were not in correspondence with Ilúvatar's will. And so on and so on. And then he deceived other angels who follow him, the same topic we see throughout the Bible. I'll stop here because there's a lot of still, many subtopics to cover. Amber, the floor is yours because I know you want to switch slightly to Heiser and Divine Counsel, and then I'll turn later to Plato.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to bring in a little bit of Heiser here because I think that there's some good overlap with what Heiser is doing with the Divine Counsel. So if you go through and look at Heiser's work, and primarily this is stuff that's taken from Heiser's articles on the Divine Counsel in the Lexington Press series of dictionaries and from Heiser's Unseen Realm. So, and I think those links are underneath also. But Heiser talks about the Divine Counsel as not being a reflection that God it's not a pantheistic system. That the term Divine Counsel was used by Hebraic and Semitic scholars to refer to the heavenly host, the pantheon of divine beings who administer the affairs of the cosmos. So, which is kind of what Tolkien is talking about with the Valar. They are helping God, but they are not they are not doing the creating themselves. They are like helping in different roles and running different things. And in this council, we see in when we look at comparisons of the Hebrew Bible and other ancient religious texts, there's overlap that is reflected in the Divine Council language with the surrounding nations and Israel's version of heavenly bureaucracy. And so, like many of these ancient Near East cultures would have a pantheistic structure that looked like the Divine Council that is mirrored. They just did not have the Hebrew idea of one God that is the only God who is the grand administrator, and then the Divine Council is given areas of administration, like Heiser talks about. And one of the things we talked about in there's this fantastic book that is called, I have to remember, it's called let me look it up for a second while I'm kind of thinking out loud. That it is called oh, good grief. Hang on. The Gods of the Nations, the Studies in Ancient Near East, in Near Eastern Theology. It is by Daniel Block. It is a fantastic.
I was about to say, I always mess up Daniel and Dara Block because they're so similar. But that's one of the books I want to buy.
Yeah, it's Daniel Block. It was a fantastic read, and it talks about this idea that is reflected in when Heiser's talking about the Divine Council, that each in the ancient world, the idea of your land is tied to your deity. And so there is this there, and they would not at this point in time understood a division like we think about the world as like a spiritual realm and an administrative realm, and they don't separate life, your physical life, from your spiritual life. It all was one thing that all functioned together. They wouldn't understand our modern context of making these divisions that we separate things into and putting things into pigeonholes or buckets. They would not have understood that idea. Everything in your universe was your religion, and it was lived out. It was your way of life. So our modern concept of like spiritual disciplines and things like that, they would have looked at you like you were crazy, because they're like, that's obvious, right? So each nation was given its own deity, which is one of these members of the Divine Council, who is running the fallen world, administering the administration over the fallen world. And this is where it gets this is hard because it's technical and complicated. So I'm trying to kind of boil it down a little bit because it can get a little squirrely to explain. But as your land holdings increased and your population increased and the victories of your monarch, were increasing, and you were winning more wars and you're getting more territory, your deity was getting stronger. And as you were losing ground and you were losing territory and your king started losing wars, your deity was getting weaker. And so there was this constant struggle between the nations as to whose god was bigger, whose god was stronger. And that was part of this administrative overseeing balance of trying to maintain a balance as this is playing out. So it is but I think there's a lot of, because Tolkien in his work talks about these different Valar coming down, and one is a specialty of the sea, one has a specialty of the love of trees, one is of the air, there's ones of different animals. Like each of these deities kind of have their own, which is, I think, it's really amazing that Tolkien had this in his head and understood all this way before Heiser's work. This was not a something that was understood at all when Tolkien is writing all of this. So Tolkien, as a storyteller, is able to look into the story of Scripture and pull all of this out without all of this, of Heiser's work and everything that's coming out now with understanding the gods of the ancient Near East. And this is just, I think this is the genius of Tolkien's storytelling, is to be able to tap into and understand and reflect these things that they weren't even, this would not have been a discussion, I think, that would have been a common one at all at this period of time. But just because of the nature of his mastery of story.
Amber, do you think we can say that Tolkien was also a theologian?
Oh, absolutely. And I think there's also definitely a tie-in with the theology of beauty that the Catholics, that I have barely started to even look at, but Catholics have this theology of beauty and theology of art, and how to interact with art in a way that reflects the Creator, that reflects God. It helps us to understand Bible and biblical ideas that a lot of modern Protestantism doesn't have, because we don't have the history anymore. And if you think about, like, most of history, a lot of folks were basically in subsistence survival mode, and most of the bulk of people were the poor. They were the blue collar, the working class. Most of them were not educated. They couldn't read. And so you get this very early in the church, and it goes back even further into the Old Testament. There is imagery painted into everything. So, I'm going to use a bad word in Protestantism, but iconography is everywhere. In the early church, in the Old Testament, and the New Testament, iconography is everywhere to help us understand the stories that are being told in Scripture. And so the Catholic Church, and I think, and I will have to ask because I don't know, so I'm only going to speak about the Catholic Church. I don't know about the Orthodox tradition. I'm still learning about iconography, but I don't want to speak where I don't have any kind of an idea. But from what I understand, the theology of art in the Roman Catholic view is giving access through interacting with God and understanding that not only just the stories, but all of trying to convey all of the theology that's behind these stories in these paintings and the stained glass, the structures of the building themselves, the any kind of like statuary or things that are created, all have a very beautiful tie into this theology of art that reflects the Creator, the narrative of Scripture, and the understanding of the theology behind it that's built into this very intentional, creative use of this understanding and reflection of God that is built into us as image bearers and into creation itself. So, yeah. And then Heiser goes on and is talking about, hang on, like, kind of lost my place there. I got a little sidetracked by all that fun stuff there. So evidence for exact same structures of the Israelite Council is a little tenuous. You can hear Tyser talking about, despite the fact that popular Israelite religion may have understood Yahweh as having a wife. This is where you get into some of the weirder parts of some of the fringe scholarship. So he was kind of trying to address that, but it talks about things like they try to make that claim in like Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2, but most of that, I think Heiser, I don't want to read tons and tons and tons, but Heiser does a pretty good job in his book Unseen Realm of debunking some of that. The biggest thing that I think we're looking at is he's talking about this idea of monotheism and the divine council, which really hits in this, what we're talking about in the Silmarillion here. So some scholars have tried to claim that this idea of divine counsel in the Hebrew Bible means that Hebrew's religion was at one time polytheistic, or henotheistic, which means there are many gods, but one is preferred. Okay. But later evolved into monotheism. But both of those presume species sameness amongst the gods. And it's pretty clear in scripture. So if we look at like where God names himself as the God, one place is like 1 Kings 18:38. And that term is Ha Elohim in Hebrew. And then several times God refers to himself as the true God, Elohim Emet. Like his Jeremiah 10:10 is one of many places that shows up. That makes it asserts the points, the belief that although Yahweh was an Elohim, that he is the Elohim among Elohim, which distinguishes him as having distinguishing characteristics as Yahweh that the other Elohim don't have. So and Hebrew does this really interesting thing where it will collect a pile of things and it will pull out one thing to show not only is it greater than the collection of things, but it's also highlighting its differences, which is part of what's happening with this Elohim and Elohim thing. There's Elohim as the divine counsel, but you have the Elohim, which is pulled up not only as better than this other lower pile of Elohim, but he's also being pulled out because he's different. So the nature of Hebrew itself is making that distinction for us there also. And Heiser goes on to talk about how that shows up in a lot of places in Psalms and Nehemiah, 1 Kings 22, Job 38, Isaiah 14, Deuteronomy 4, Deuteronomy 32. And that's reflected in the Septuagint and the Qumran in Deuteronomy 17, 29, 32. So it is one of those things that unfortunately English doesn't do a very good job of distinguishing, that Hebrew does a better job at distinguishing. But when you start to really get and dig into works of people like Heiser and let these, because this is Hebrew that is a little beyond my ability at this point. I had to go in and do some research on this myself because I'm still learning. So I'm not an expert in Hebrew by any stretch of the imagination. I've gotten just enough to know what I'm talking about and get myself in a lot of trouble at the same time. So I'm still learning Hebrew. So let's put that out there too. But there's a distinction that's made that the lesser Elohim are not merely idols. Deuteronomy 32:17, when we look at the broader statements of God and idols, kind of makes a separation here that like as it's quoted, and I don't remember which version this is, so my apologies, because I'm looking at one of Heiser's entries in this dictionary here. They sacrifice to demons, which is sadim in Hebrew, who are not God, Eloha, which is a singular noun, which would be a lowercase or no, who are not, okay, singular now, which would be the one God. Sorry, I got that backwards. All right. To the gods Elohim, that would be plural, lowercase g, they did not know. And to new gods that had come along recently, whom your fathers had not reverenced. So the Hebrew there is even making that distinction again between the little g gods Elohim and the big G God, Yahweh. Sometimes he's referred to. There's a lot of names for God, so it can get a little. Sometimes it can get a little overwhelming and technical at the same time. But that's where parsing that out can get a little complicated. And so let's see. Does that kind of clarify a little bit? Do we need to go into some more of the actual divine council itself, or do you have any questions about that, Nico? Let's go there.
I don't have a question, but maybe just for the sake of the audience, if you want to spend
Okay.
additional couple of minutes just maybe
Okay.
explaining in layman terms what is the divine council, and
Okay.
just something like that you may think it will help the audience.
Okay. So oh boy, I'm trying to figure out how to. So I don't want to overly reduce it, because sometimes if you overly explain things, you take away some of the idea of some of the mystery that's built in that we have to kind of contemplate and reflect on ourselves to fully understand this idea, which is what Hebrew is designed to do. It's a little vague on purpose because it wants you to think about things. So that is one of the differences between Hebrew and Greek. Hebrew loves metaphor, and it loves to leave a mystery for you to contemplate and think about. And Greek loves to get obsessive with explaining everything. And if they don't have a word for it, they'll create a word for it. Paul is a master at that in his letters and in his epistles, right? So that's kind of the difference that we're dealing with. So when we're dealing with Hebrew, we got to leave a little room to contemplate. But what this kind of looks like, I guess, if you were to say, maybe to try to put this in like something that we're more familiar with in our modern context, that God is like the president, CEO, the only one in charge, and the divine council is like his top level vice presidents, the guys in charge of running all of the other things. So they step in, they work on behalf of the CEO president, and they kind of manage some of those detailed pieces. But the CEO is still ultimately in charge, still ultimately knows what's going on. He's keeping track of what's happening and intervenes when necessary, steers the ship, tries, keeps everything on course, keeps everyone on mission, herding the cats in the right direction. So, that's kind of the idea. And then you've got, the angels, which are a layer beneath, which are going to be your, layer under your vice presidents, who's going to be like your regional things that are going to have even more specific jobs that they do. So, we see especially in the Old Testament, there are certain angels that have certain jobs. They're sent to do different things. And there's there's not very many angels listed by name, so this is where it gets a little fuzzy sometimes. But Michael is portrayed as fighting with the adversary over the body of Moses in the book of Jude, I believe, in Jude 9, I think is where that is. You see Gabriel delivers a lot of messages. But you see them showing up, sometimes giving warnings, sometimes they're relaying messages, sometimes they're interpreting dreams and visions. So there's different jobs that they do, which would be the same thing as in that corporate structure. They're going to be the ones underneath with the very specific and targeted jobs. So, and then you've got the humans on the bottom down there, which are the poor working stiffs who are doing all the actual work, while the other guys up in the structure are doing all the office head work. You've got the guys under the bottom which are the humans who are just playing out the orders and the instructions, and how all that filters down through those divine council structures in the way that they're thinking about that. So, and I think, yeah, I think that's probably the best way I can kind of make a correlation. That's a terrible analogy because all analogies end up breaking down in the end, but that might be kind of a way to get your head around that imagery some.
Yeah, and I think it will be fair to say that it wasn't just the ancient Hebrews, but also their Gentile neighbors who had this concept of the main deity in their
Right.
pantheon, and then lesser gods who would work on their or act on their behalf, who would be probably most often being created. So they would have origin,
Mhm.
and they'll be over certain, regions or portions, if I can call
Mhm.
portions, but segments of nature or land or weather or whatnot. So, and these entities, this so-called God with small g, in most of these mythologies and religions, would be depicted almost like
Mhm.
uh, jealous, angry, drunk uh, politicians slash warriors who would like want to be competing with each other and portraying many times the worst human characteristics from my studies. And
Right.
it's like you can tell, like, you know, so there's divine council motive or concept in many ancient religions and mythologies, but
Mhm.
just because the word divine council is the same, that doesn't mean um, that divine council in the Bible and biblical theology is the same one as we will see with Canaanites, with Babylonians, with so
Right.
many other nations. But it still helps to say, hey, this was kind of normal for the ancient people.
Right.
So it's nothing new for us. Is new and weird, but that God has a
Right.
council, and He does
Mhm.
not need them. He chooses out of love to use angels just the same way He uses to choose us, and hopefully me in this modest through this modest podcast, but he doesn't need me. He doesn't need us. God does
Right.
it through his love. So I would say that's the one of the differences in this divine council of motives between different sacred books and religions.
Right. So, like, for example, one that people might be familiar with is Babylon, because it shows up obviously as a major player in the Old Testament. So they started out when they were in competition with Assyria. They kind of back and forth shared the deed of Enlil and I can't remember the other one. There's a pair, but Enlil was the one who ended up winning that battle, and then he's running their own version of the divine council. And then at a certain point, where Marduk comes and overthrows and upsets Enlil, and it turns out that Marduk becomes the big dog in charge, the deity in charge of Babylon by the time we get into the prophetic books and we see Babylon come on the scene. So they started with Enlil, and then there was an overthrow, a divine council overthrow, and Marduk takes over. So sometimes you'll see, most of the time it's Marduk mentioned, but the imagery of Enlil comes in the first chapter of Ezekiel, where you're starting to see they're living in captivity, and in his vision and his with the fire and the lightning, that mindset would have understood that's imagery that is associated in their minds with Enlil. And it's a play out and a repeat of what's happening in Exodus with the overthrow of the Egyptian pantheon. So by the end, at the very end of the first chapter of Ezekiel, we're thinking, well, this makes sense. We're in Babylon. This is Enlil. And all of a sudden it's like Yahweh. Nope, it's Yahweh, which gets into some really fun other tangent of theology, but this is where we kind of get this idea of divine councils, and then there are some overthrows, and ultimately God is the ultimate member of or head of all of the divine councils because he is the creator of everything. So
Was the other entity called something like Enki? Enlil, and Enki?
Enki, I think, yeah, Enlil and Enki, I think is
Can I cross reference to what you said? Isn't this same thing happening in Psalm 91 when those was it pestilence, plague, whatever they're mentioned?
mhm,
Like we just read English translation or whatever language you're reading Bible in. But like in original, some of these names are actually pagan gods that like hold
mhm,
supposedly area over sickness or death or war
Right.
or whatever. But so so that's why Psalm 91 will be considered as like a normal, almost like an exorcism, like a
Right.
chapter, right? So I think what you're saying, what you just said about Enki and Enlil, can also be in Psalm 91, or like that.
Mhm.
Oh, like it's not Baal who is the rider on the chariots, or rider on the clouds. It's Yahweh. So we see this
Right.
over and over again. But
Right.
only people who study these things can notice these things, and this is
Right.
the beauty of biblical theology.
Yeah. Exactly. All
So
right.
do you want me to switch to Plato, or you
Yeah,
have more material?
yeah. No, I think this is a great time because this pantheon idea is going to play in really well to Plato and the Greek pantheon, and what Plato I think what we're going to get into in Plato here. So it's a perfect time to transition.
Okay, can you see my text?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, so this comes from I bought this book. There are two Plato's work combined, Timaeus and Critias. Critias is very intriguing because it speaks about Atlantis, and it also has gods and divine council in it. So we'll try to cover this by the end if we have time. Timaeus is very interesting because through this philosophical dialogue between Socrates and Timaeus, they speak of the origin of the universe. And just like with Tolkien, this resembles, Genesis. So instead of reading from this book, because it's kind of old translation, I found another publicly available PDF. And again, I provide all the links for you guys. So I'll be just reading yellow text. So Socrates is asking questions, and now Timaeus is answering. Well, let us state the reason why becoming and the universe were constructed by the artificer. He was good, and in the good no envy ever arises about anything, and being devoid of envy, he desires that all things be as much like himself as possible. He would then be absolutely right to accept from men of understanding that this is the supreme source of becoming and of the cosmos. For the God desired that all be good, and as far as possible nothing be imperfect. He therefore took everything that was visible, which was not at rest, but moving discordantly and randomly, and he led it from disorder to order, regarding order as entirely superior to disorder. But it was not then, nor is it now, lawful for the supreme good to enact anything except the supremely beautiful. So on reflection, he discovered that from whatever is visible by nature, nothing that is made without nous or nous. When I Google, it says that this is mind or intelligence. Okay, so let's speak about this as the capital mind. Mind with capital M, as there is intelligence behind this mind, and it's not human mind, right? So he discovered that from whatever is visible by nature, nothing that is made visible without nous is, on the whole, ever better than something which possesses nous. Is it nous or nous or nous? I don't know.
I think it's nos, but I'm not. It's been a long time since I've taken Greek, so I'm the wrong person to ask.
Yeah, people have to, maybe I can read it as mind.
Yeah.
And furthermore, that mind cannot be present in anything in the absence of soul. Based on this reflection, having placed mind in soul and soul in body, he, meaning God, constructed the universe so that once completed, it would naturally be as beautiful and excellent a piece of work as was possible. Accordingly, based upon the likely account, we must state that this cosmos is a living creature with soul and mind, and that has, in truth, come into being through the providence of God. This being the case, we should go on to state our next topic in due order. In the likeness of which of the living creatures did the Maker construct the cosmos? Let us not degrade it to something which by nature has parts, for that is incomplete, and the likeness of something incomplete would never be beautiful. Instead, we propose that the cosmos resembles more than anything else, whatever all other species and classes of living beings, individually or on the basis of categories, are parts of. In fact, that cosmos contains within itself all living things that can be discerned by mind, just as this cosmos contains us and all creatures which can be discerned by sight. The God wished the cosmos to resemble the most beautiful and entirely perfect of all that mind perceives. So he constructed a single visible living creature containing within it all creatures that are by nature kindred to it. Now, whatever has come to be must have bodily form and be visible and tangible, but nothing could ever have become visible without fire or tangible without something solid or solid without earth. Hence, as he began to construct the body of the universe, God made it from fire and earth. Now, it is not possible for two things to be combined well on their own without a third. For some bond is required between the two to draw them together. The very best bond is that which, as much as possible, makes itself as the conjoined entities one. And it is proportion that by nature best accomplishes this. So then, if the body of the universe had to come into being having surface but no depth, a single mean would have sufficed to bind its constituents. Okay, I don't know what is that. Together with itself. But now, since it has a solid structure, and solids are never conjoined by one middle term, but by two, God therefore placed water and air between fire and earth, and insofar as it was possible, he arranged that they have the same proportion to one another, so that as fire is to air, air is to water, and as air is to water, water is to earth. This he bound together and constructed a visible and tangible heaven. And for these reasons, and from such constituents, like you said, whatever, as these, four in number, the body of the cosmos was generated, having been harmonized by proportion and endowed from these with affection, so that having come to sameness with itself, it was rendered indissoluble,
I think.
by anyone except he who conjoined it. Now, for the construction of the cosmos actually consumed each of these four elements entirely. For the artificer constructed it from all of the fire and water, and also the air and earth, and not one part of power or any being left outside of it. He decided this for the following reasons. Firstly, so that it will be as whole and perfect a living being as possible, made from perfect parts. And I know this is philosophical, so bear with me, but there's a point to this. In addition to this, it was to be one, since there would be nothing left over from which something else of this kind could be generated. It was also to be free from old age and disease, as he realized that if a composite body surrounded by heat or cold or any powerful forces outside it, they attack it and bring it to an ultimately untimely end, and by inducing disease and old age, they make it waste away. And by the way, for some people, this is complex. It is somewhat complex, but just get any philosophical book that is more difficult than this. Take Thomas Aquinas. You'll be lost. You'll be screaming if you think this is difficult. So this is, I think, beginning of philosophy, or a little bit slightly more advanced. So it shouldn't be that difficult, and people can always go and read for themselves more slowly. So for this reason, and based upon this consideration, he fashioned it whole, composed of all these wholes, one perfect, ageless, and incorruptible, and he gave a shape to it that was appropriate and belonged to its nature. The shape which contains all other shapes within itself was appropriate for the living being that is going to embrace all other living beings within itself. So he turned it to make it circular, a spherical shape having all of its extremities equidistant from its center. Dude, like before Jesus's time, Plato wrote that the earth was not flat, and
Mhm.
we're still discussing with this in 2024, almost 2025. This is
Yep.
embarrassing. Even Plato and the Gentiles and
Oops.
philosophers, they knew so much more than today's people. And that's embarrassing with all these libraries and Amazon and archives and articles online and everything. We are so incredibly ignorant today. I'll read this sentence again. The shape which contains all other shapes within itself was appropriate for the living being that is going to embrace all other all other living beings within itself. So he turned it to be circular, a spherical shape, having all of its extremities equidistant from its center. This is the most perfect of all shapes and the one most uniform with itself. And uniformity he regarded as infinitely better than non-uniformity. And so he polished it all smooth and round on the outside for many reasons. It was contrived by design so as to provide its own food from its own wastes and to experience everything within itself and enact everything by itself because he who assembled it thought it would be better for it to be independent rather than being dependent on others. Accordingly, he caused it to move by revolving in a circle, leading it around in the same way, in the same place within itself. This was the entire thinking of the God who is always about the God that was soon to be. And based on this thinking, he made it smooth and uniform, a complete perfect body composed of perfect bodies, everywhere equal from the center. He placed soul in the middle of it and stretched it through the entire body and even covered the outside of the body with it and established one single solitary round heaven revolving in a circle. It was able, because of its excellence, to interact with itself, having no need of any other, as it was acquaintance and friend enough to itself. For all these reasons, what he created was a blessed God. Almost biblical. This last sentence was
Mhm.
super biblical. But
Yep.
although we are now endeavoring to speak of the soul after the description of the body, and I think these are the last two paragraphs. God did not accordingly contrive that the soul be younger, for when he combined them, he would not have allowed the elder to be ruled by the younger. But we, with our accustomed degree of um, casualness, speak in this somewhat random fashion, but in fact, he constructed the soul to be elder and prior to the body in birth and in excellence, its mistress and ruler. He made the soul from the following constituents in this manner. I'm sorry for that word. From being that is undivided and ever the same, and being which by contrast comes into existence apportioned to bodies, he formed a third intermediate from of being from both of them. Next, he mixed the nature of same and other in like manner, making a third intermediate from between their undivided form and their form as apportioned to bodies. He then took these three mixtures and mixed them all into one, and as the nature of other was difficult to mix, he blended it with same by force. Then, having mixed this with the help of being and made one from the three, he apportioned this whole once more into as many parts as was fitting, each part fitting a mixture of same, other, and being, and so on and so. Oh, okay. Let me read it. Let's assume this is the conclusion. When the entire construction of the soul had been completed in accordance with the reasoning of the one who constructed it, he then fashioned within it all that was bodily form, and having brought both together, he fastened them center to center. And soul, being woven entirely throughout the heaven from center to extremity, and folded it in a complete circle on the outside and revolving in herself, initiated a divine beginning of unceasing and intelligent life for all time. Now, while the body of the heaven is indeed visible, soul of its part is invisible, partaking of reason and harmony, the best of created things, created by the very best of all that is known by mind and is always.
Mhm.
Whew. Okay, I'll stop sharing, but this was the gist of it. I mean, Amber, I know it was philosophical, a little bit difficult to follow, especially if I butcher a few words here and there. But basically, the gist of it is the great mind um, is behind the creation. And it's called God. In the translation of this gentleman, the God is, not capitalized, it's small g, but still, it says the God. So it's
Mhm.
the one and only God that I would imagine philosophers believed in. My former philosophy professor actually thought that God could have and possibly did reveal himself to the Greek philosophers before Christ. And I don't know
Mhm.
which um, theologian or church father called Plato the first Christian, right? So by reading and trying to understand this, let's not even discuss so much about the body and soul difference, but the
Mhm.
beginning of everything and how God did not want it to make it in the image of something that had parts, but something that was like unique and divine and invisible. We see something that resembles biblical language, but in more
Right.
philosophical form. What is your opinion?
Okay, well, this is where it gets super fun and super interesting because when you pull in Tolkien and Plato, and then we compare that to what's going on in Genesis and get into the Hebrew, this gets really exciting because this is the fun stuff, right? So last semester, we spent the entire semester every week. We retranslated Genesis 1 through 5 for sure. And then added a little bit every single time. But we spent 5 months in the first 5 verses of Genesis. And one of the things that I really appreciated about doing that and digging into this language so much. So Genesis starts Bereshit bara Elohim, and in that it's translated from mostly tradition, in the beginning God, right? But that word rashit there, um, at the beginning. So the b at the beginning is a, oh, this is falling out of my head, a preposition, and then rashit, the word there, can also mean head, as in this thing on top of your shoulders. So one interesting alternative way to reflect on Genesis 1 is from the head of God. So from the imagination of God, from the creativity of God, the heavens and the earth were created. So you could get this interplay, and where I think that it ties into, and what Tolkien was tapping into with his imagery of this idea of the song that starts with Eru Eluvatar, and that the divine council join in with this song. We see this idea of the interplay of the Trinity in Genesis 1 with this song imagery of this weaving um, of the creation cycles that we see of creating a space and filling a space. But that not only comes from the beginning, as we see the beginning of the story, it also originates in the creativity of God, that is reflected, I think, in Tolkien's song, which also ties into Plato's idea of um, this, of that picture that he's painting there with how his version of the world is created. I think it all reflects this idea that is resonating in Genesis, of this beauty of from the overflow of the creativity, love, and blessing of Yahweh, this beautiful world is created, and in that is woven, the Holy Spirit is involved. It is, and that leaves shadows, echoes, imprints, fingerprints, however you want to understand that presence of God woven into the very creation. It is left everywhere because it comes out not just of the words that God speaks, but it also comes out of God's creativity, love, a blessing of overflow that it starts creation in that process, and his wanting to bless in the first place. So it just is this, beautiful idea. And we see this play out throughout all of Genesis 1, as he's not only with these patterns of creating and filling, but it is over and over, patterns upon patterns upon patterns that add layers and layers and layers to this song, weaving creation together. And it's really fun when you get in, like when it gets to light and dark, or that idea of the void that we saw. And let me look at this, because I don't want to get this wrong. So let me pull it up. So that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Hang on, let me open up my VHS so I can look at the Hebrew again, because it is so beautifully done. But that tohu, that Bereshit bara Elohim et Hashemayim hata haaretz, which is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's when you get into, hang on, I got to pull those side by side. Verse 2 with formless and formless and void is the most likely way that you see that. But this is a really fun Hebrew thing that goes tohu vavohu. It's like nothing and nothing, but it's a word play where when Hebrew does this they're playing with phonetics too. There's a sound component here that we miss because we don't speak Hebrew. But tohu vavohu is nothing, and then it's doubling down on its nothingness. So this is an idea of complete, total, utter chaos, of unorganized, the antithesis, the actual opposite of God. So God is coming in and establishing order. So he is bringing order out of chaos. And we see this pattern over and over. And Tolkien, I think, reflects this beautifully when he talks about and introduces, where Melkor introduces this disresonant stream into the song, because Melkor, as a reflection of the adversary, or what we would call as Satan, is the one who is trying to undo the order that God is bringing. He is the agent of chaos. He is the agent of destruction. He is the agent of decay. And so you see that woven in as well. You've got that theme where it is the beautiful ordering of Yahweh of this chaos into order, and this interjection by the adversary to try to disrupt that order that is bringing more chaos. So he's trying to deconstruct what God has constructed, but God continually reconstructs it. And so much of the language of the day of the Lord, the final day of the Lord analogy of eschatology, is the final decreation and recreation, where Christ, as Christus Victor, comes in and is reestablishing his final victory over creation and the final establishment of that order that is completely putting an end to that chaos. And so it just is, I love this. This is Genesis 1 is one of my favorite things to nerd out about. So so it just and this is an idea that is reflected in both Plato and in Tolkien's stories of how the world is brought into order, and a beautiful picture that is reflected in this idea of divine creativity and imagination that brings order into chaos at the beginning of the story. So yeah, I think that's where they all tie together and all land in Genesis 1.
Okay, thank you for that. I have a question. Is it okay if I have two commentary on Plato? From both PDFs, I'll read few to several pages, but not every word. And then we can finish by sharing some of the Plato's work from Critias that has to deal with gods and divine council of the Atlantis. And I think that would be a nice, conclusion to the episode, with, of course, some of your commentaries in between. that fine?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll be sharing my screen. Okay, so I have to give a little intro, and I would like your comment, your opinion, brief one here, and then we'll dive into what the author of this PDF says. He says, the one claim that is the 6th century philosopher theologian John Philoponus, in his commentary on the biblical creation story, was correct not only in pointing out striking similarities in substance and detail between it and the cosmology of Plato's Timaeus, which then became a commonplace in Christian interpretations of the Timaeus, but also in attempting to provide at least rudimentally, a historical reason for the perceived affinity. The standard only vaguely historical claims that Plato and the authors of Genesis shared in some common Mediterranean mode of cosmological speculation, or that both were divinely inspired by, quote unquote, the truth, or that Plato possessed an anima naturaliter Christiana, simply will not do. Both the biblical author of Genesis and Plato, in writing the Timaeus, were indebted to far older Egyptian cosmological thinking. So this is his thesis. This guy, I don't know if he's a Christian, but he believes that both Moses, while writing Genesis, and Plato draw their inspiration from Egyptian wisdom. But before I ask you a question, check this out. This paper employs a good dose of speculation to fabricate one. I'm like, okay, but still, like, you wrote a lengthy paper, 16 pages, semi-lengthy, and it says a good dose of speculation, but he still believes, and he calls this corpus hermeneuticum, and he suggests that, all of them drew to, like he says here, genuine Egyptian lore, i.e., African philosophy, if you will. So before I continue reading parts that we can agree, I don't agree with this, but I just want to ask you, in your master studies, have you encountered of this speculation or this, like wild hypothesis that, Moses and Plato both drew from Egyptian wisdom?
Okay. I'm not.
You're not
Yeah,
familiar.
I don't know. I don't. Yeah, I
So you
I don't
never
have a
heard of
comment
this?
on that.
Yeah, I was just curious if this is like
Yeah,
popular or well known among the biblical, theologians, but it seems like he's one of few that holds to this position. I was like, is this a thing?
it
Because we
sounds a
know
little. Yeah, sounds a little out
what?
there to me. So I don't know.
Yeah,
I've never
as we
heard of
know,
it. So yeah.
as we know, a small portion of Proverbs comes or is inspired by Egyptian wisdom. So that's not a secret. That's not like some conspiracy. But I never heard when it comes to Moses. So I'm like, okay, let me ask Henry. Okay. Uh, so this Christian philosopher Philoponus makes repeated and surprising claims about Plato. He suggests, often explicitly, not only that Plato's Timaeus is largely in agreement with the biblical creation story, which he assumes to have been written by Moses. Well, he doesn't just assume. I mean, Jesus says that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, even though it was slightly or somewhat edited and compiled together after his death. I mean, but still, he's the author. So we're not inventing, we're taking Jesus' words seriously. By that, the Greek philosopher, in fact, imitated him. Philoponus repeatedly claims that Plato was familiar with Moses. And honestly, this does make sense. If Moses came way before Plato and he wrote, I don't see why is that troubling for the author of this PDF. And when he set out to write his own story of the creation, adopted central points as well as matters of detail from the biblical account, turning them into features of his own narrative. Plato never acknowledged any such indebtedness. He doesn't have to. Why is that not possible? So this is also a crucial part of this author. Philoponus never tells us how this sort of influence was supposed to have taken place, and he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to give every detail. to have such a theory. The Septuagint was composed in Alexandria well over 100 years after Plato's death, at the earliest, so he cannot have come across a copy of it. Did Philoponus think Plato visited Israel, or that he perhaps hosted a Jewish affiliate in the academy? We do not know. Philoponus is silent on what he imagined the precise historical circumstances of such influence to have been, except that he claims at one point vaguely that Plato, quote unquote, heard or learned of Moses' cosmogony. Okay, so what is the problem with this? If Moses lived at least 1,000 years before Plato, and if Israel and Greece are not that geographically that far from each other, and if Israel and people of Israel were in different countries and on different continents for different reasons, being enslaved, traveling, trading, having intermarried relationships, both faithful and unfaithful Jews, what is the problem if not just the goods and marriages were exchanged, but also information and beliefs? I mean, isn't this part of Moses's point and some other portions of the Old Testament that was written in polemics? The Jews had to know what their neighbors believed in order to combat and practice sound theology and apologetics. So then, if the information was traveling, what will be the problem 1,000 years after Moses, or even more, that Plato would hear about Genesis story? I seriously don't see this as a problem. Any comment on this?
I'm just a little baffled because Moses was born, like people think, in conservative dating, like the 14th century BCE, and Plato was born in 427 BC. So there's like a lot of gap between the two of them. And you hear that. Okay, so then we also like run into this idea that when you're talking about the Torah was stolen from the Code of Hammurabi or from the Egyptians, or it's the same kind of idea, right? That the Hebrew and the biblical authors stole from everybody else. And so when we were talking about this in Torah class one day, and the lady who was teaching that class was also my Hebrew professor second year. She just kind of shook her head and she goes, look, this is what we have to say to that. If somebody steals your ox, which is a main mode of your survival, it doesn't matter where they steal your ox. In this is part of the world. Every religion and every culture is going to have to deal with what do you do with somebody who steals your ox? And they're going to have similar ways to deal with that because they're living in the same part of the world. These cultures interacted with each other. Moses, we know from the book of Exodus, was trained and working in Pharaoh's government. So he was probably in some sort of a scribe or translator role, would have spoken multiple languages, and having been involved in corresponding with other nations around him, would have been familiar with the laws and the cultures of these other surrounding things. And it's like, yeah, they're going to see, it's not uncommon for somebody to go, hey, I have a problem. How's everybody else dealing with this? This sounds like a good idea, but I'm going to reinterpret it into my religious context. So we're going to do this our way, but we're going to deal with the same problem that everybody's having. So it's not, I think, as big of a deal as people are making it out to be, because we're, just all these cultures are at the same time trying to deal with the same problem. So, it's how is the Egyptian religious understanding going to deal with this problem? How is the Babylonian, Assyrian, Mesopotamian context? How is Yahweh wanting Israel and his, the Hebrews to deal with this? So it's just their various religious filters dealing with the same problem. And it's not, like I said, not as huge of an idea of a problem as people make it out to be, really, I don't think.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So I just wanted to read that as intro to see that while we may disagree with an author, he also did a nice job in comparing, the claim written by Philoponus between Plato and Moses. So I just want to read a few of them so we can actually see. So in text 1, DOM 4:15 to 7:1, Plato imitates Moses. And quote this quotation that Plato, in his description of the generation of the world, in fact imitated Moses. So this is what Philoponus said. And it is not at all astonishing that it was in this way that the exceedingly old Moses set out the story of the making of the world for those to be introduced to the knowledge of God. When even Plato, who taught the production of the whole from God to people who were already philosophers, imitated Moses in many different respects. But when all the celestial beings had come to be, he introduces the demiurge. I don't know what it is.
I don't know that. Demiurge. Okay, demiurge.
Okay. Yeah, himself as he's ordering them in this way. And of course, we will not read this. I want to just read the beginning of every of these claims. Then text 2, DOM 8:18 to 9:1, the co-creation of time. Since God established time together with the heavens, and since he made heavens and earth in the first and partless now of time, which is the beginning of time, Basil says that this is the beginning in terms of time of what we're talking about. It's momentary and unextended. It is on this basis that Plato begins with, quote unquote, this came to be together with the heaven, and writes most beautifully, another quotation, so that having become together, they will also perish together, should there ever be a perishing of them. Another text, DOM 78:15 to 27, the problem of light. And all these quotations, again, are coming from Philoponus, right?
Mhm.
Perhaps that light was even a corporeal substance, not formed in the same way as the stars, and the two light sources are corporeal substances now, but God put it into the order that they now have when he assigned this light to the sun and the moon and the remaining stars. In this way, too, nothing impossible seems to follow. Perhaps Plato again took this up when he says that God wanted everything to be good and nothing to be bad as far as that was possible. And so he took over all that was visible, not at rest, but in discordant and disorderly motion, and brought it from a state of disorder to one of order, because he believed that order was in every way better than disorder. Nothing is visible without light. Text 4, DOM 117:24 to 119:5. The stereoma of heaven. What is the substance of the celestial body, and which could one infer from the cosmogony of Moses, and that Plato concurs with Moses? Concerning the substance of the stereoma, Plato put it together out of the four elements, and we've read this. But the sun and the moon and the other stars he put together mostly out of fire. When Plato heard of Moses' cosmogony, he said that the heavens are a solid body because they participated in earth. For he says, earth is the only element that is a solid body and has resistance. I'll do a few more, and that's it for this PDF. Text 5, DOM 134, the perishability of the world. Philoponus quotes words from Isaiah and the Psalms that suggest the perishability of the world. But I think, again, that Plato borrowed from these passages when he introduces the demiurge, who says to the celestial beings, if it came to be, the all will not be indestructible or immortal, for everything put together is destructible. Only that which is put together by my will will be indestructible. Text 6, DOM 273, 1 to 10, creation as imitation. Plato adopted from Moses that man was created in God's image, and then he transferred that to everything inside the Word. While Moses said about mankind in the proper sense that it is created in God's image and likeness, Plato extended that to all things in the world, speaking thus, quote, he was good, but envy never accrues to anyone good in any respect. Devoid of envy, he wanted the all to be like him as much as possible, end quote. Text 7, DOM 303:20 to 304:5, praise of creation. Since it has been shown that nothing made by God is bad without qualification, but each is most beautiful, the great Moses nicely says when he wraps up his cosmogony. And God saw all that he made, and behold, it was very beautiful. That Plato also imitated and praised, that Plato also imitated the praise for what has come to be. And Plato imitates Moses also in this regard when he taught that the universe came into existence by God. And when he, Plato, supposed that heaven was already in motion, he says this: now when the Father who had begotten the universe observed it, set in motion and alive, a thing he had come to be as an adornment for the everlasting gods, he rejoiced and thought of making it even more similar to its paradigm. And I'll end this. I'll end here. To summarize, one could say that Philoponus saw the following points of agreement between Plato and Moses. And this is a lot. Look, like 15. I'll just start with some. So let me mention some of these. The creation of the world is the work of a cosmic intelligence. 2, creation involves speech acts. 3, creation also involves imitation of paradigms, mankind in the case of Moses, or the entire cosmos in the case of Plato. 4, time was co-created with the world. 5, light can exist separately, not as an attribute of a substance such as the sun. 6, the God created world is perishable, if not actually so, then at least conceptually. 7, heavens consist of some or all of the 4 elements, not any divine substance such as ether. 8, the goodness of God's creation deserves human praise. And there are like 7 more. I'll stop here, and I have one more short PDF, but I want to ask you, what do you think of this? Does it make sense that that at least in this second part of the PDF from this gentleman, that there's so many similarities between Plato and Moses that it just seems, I'm not saying it seems impossible that it's not copied but inspired by Moses. But even if that didn't happen, it seems to me that God in some way revealed something supernaturally to Greek philosophers. Because even in our systematic theology, we use a lot of Greek philosophy for our theology. So to me, when I'm reading something, it almost seems obvious that either God revealed some stuff to Plato, or Plato was inspired, not copied, not stole, but was inspired by Moses. This seems to me, especially in this last few minutes when the author of this PDF summarized the similarities. There are too many to say, oh, it's nothing. 15 of them just in creation. That seems many details to me personally. Would you agree?
Yeah, and there would have been very early translations of the Septuagint, which was originally just the Pentateuch floating around. So Plato, being an educated guy and liking to educate himself, it's not outside the realm of possibility that he got his hands on a copy and read it. I don't have a problem with that at all. It's interconnectedness with sources outside the Bible isn't a problem. I don't think. I think it just, like you said, it echoes this, not only how, Greek was the language franca at the time, and everybody would have spoke Greek, and he was well read and educated, but this echo of God's understanding, God's revelation and knowledge of God reflected in creation and imagination, and interacting with creation on a level we don't quite understand. So I think I don't have a problem with it at all.
So for the sake of time, I just decided not to read the last PDF because it's included. If people want to read, there's more comparison and explanations between Plato and Moses, and now Aristotle is in the game in this other PDF. But let me just read some portions of Critias. So I would like you to comment when it comes to divine counsel, because I think it's really interesting for your section, for your segment. Okay, I read this a while ago, so I'm just going to read what I underlined, not everything. Okay, Critias, page 131. We must first remind ourselves that in all 9,000 years have elapsed since the declaration of war between those who lived outside and all those who lived inside the pillars of Heracles. At the time, as we said, Atlantis was an island larger than Libya and Asia put together, though it was subsequently overwhelmed by earthquakes and is the source of the impenetrable mud which prevents the free passage of those who sail out of the straits into the open sea. Once upon a time, the gods divided up the earth between them. Check this out. Okay, because I'm excited, even though I've read this. I have a question. Have you read this before?
No, I've never read this before.
Yes, I'm the first storyteller who revealed to you the divine council in Atlantis. Like, it's an insane combo. I'm so excited because I want you to be excited. Okay.
Okay.
Once upon a time, the gods divided up the earth between them, not in the course of a quarrel, for it would be quite wrong to think that the gods do not know what is appropriate to them, or that knowing it, they would want to annex what properly belongs to others. Each gladly received his just allocation and settled his territories, and having done so, they proceeded to look after us, their creatures and children, as shepherds look after their flocks. They did not use physical means of control, like shepherds who direct their flocks with blows, but brought their influence to bear on the creature's most sensitive part, using persuasion as a steersman uses the helm to direct the mind as they saw fit, and so to guide the whole mortal creature. The various gods then administered the various regions which had been allotted to them. So Deuteronomy 32. It's like, oh, it's beautiful. But these are Greek gods, Atlantean Greek gods. But Hephaestus, something like that, and Athene, who shared as brother and sister a common character and pursued the same ends in their love of knowledge and skill, were allotted this land of ours as their joint sphere and as a suitable and natural home for excellence and wisdom. They produced a native race of good men and gave them suitable political arrangements. Their names have been preserved, but what they did has been forgotten because of the destruction of their successors and the long lapse of time. For as we said before, the survivors of this destruction were an unlettered mountain race who had just heard the names of the rulers of the land, but knew little of their achievements. Just a couple more pages. I'm going to skip page 136. We have already mentioned how the gods distributed the whole earth between them in larger or smaller shares and then established shrines and sacrifices for themselves. Oh my gosh. Poseidon's share was the island of Atlantis, and he settled the children born to him by a mortal woman in a particular district of it. So a god slept with a mortal woman. Another, oh my gosh. At the center of the island, near the sea, was a plain said to be the most beautiful and fertile of all plains, and near the middle of this plain, about 50 stades inland, a hill of no great size. Here there lived one of the original earthborn inhabitants called Evenor, with his wife Lucip. They had an only child, a daughter called whatever, Cleto. I don't know. She was just of marriageable age when her father and mother died, and Poseidon was attracted by her and had intercourse with her, and fortified the hill where she lived by enclosing it with concentric rings of sea and land. There were 2 rings of land and 3 of sea, like cartwheels, with the island at their center and equidistant from each other, making the place inaccessible to men, for there were still no ships or sailing in those days. He equipped the central island with godlike lavishness. He made 2 springs flow, one of hot and one of cold water, and caused the earth to grow abundant produce of every kind. He begot 5 pairs of male twins, brought him up and divided the island of Atlantis into 10 parts, which he distributed between them. He allotted the elder of the eldest pair of twins his mother's home district and the land surrounding it, the biggest and best allocation, and made him king over the others. The others he made governors, each of a populous and large territory. He gave them all names. The eldest, the king, he gave a name from which the whole island and surrounding ocean took their designation of Atlantic, deriving it from Atlas, the first king. His twin, to whom was allocated the furthest part of the island towards the Pillars of Heracles and facing the district now called Gadira, was called in Greek Eumelus, but in his own language Gadirus. Of the second pair, he called one Amphiris and the other Eumaon. I'm sorry, they have so many vowels, and all these words, all these names have so many vowels. The elder of the third pair was called blah blah. This is not important. Okay. Their wealth was greater than that possessed by any previous dynasty or kings or likely to be accumulated by any later. It had minerals, resources from which were mined both solid materials and metals, including one metal which survives today only in name, but was then mined in quantities in a number of localities in the island, which is called auricalc. In those days, the most valuable metal except gold. And I'm almost done. The diameter of the island on which the palace was situated was 5 stades, or stades. It and the rings of the bridges, which were 100 feet broad, were enclosed by a stone wall around, with towers and gates guarding the bridges on either side where they crossed the water. In the center was a shrine sacred to Poseidon and his wife Plato, whatever it's pronounced, surrounded by a golden wall through which entry was forbidden, as it was the place where the family of the 10 kings was conceived and begotten. And there, year by year, seasonal offerings were made from the 10 provinces to each one of them. So people were bringing sacrifices to these gods. It was a temple of Poseidon himself, a stady in length, 300 feet wide, and proportionate in height, though somewhat outlandish in appearance. The outside of it was covered all with silver, except for the figures of the pediment, which were covered in gold. Okay, I will skip the description. There was an altar of a size and workmanship to match that of the building, and a palace equally worthy of the greatness of the empire and the magnificence of its temples. The outflow they led into the grove of Poseidon, which was full of trees of marvelous beauty and height, and also channeled it to the other ring islands by aqueducts and the bridges. On each of these ring islands, they had built many temples. This is also important, many temples for different gods, and many gardens and areas for exercise, some for men and some for horses. Forget women, some for men, some for horses, okay? On the middle of the larger island in particular, there was a special course for horse racing. Round on it, both sides were barracks for the main body of the king's bodyguard. A more select body of the more trustworthy were stationed on the smaller island ring near the citadel. So this was like a well-established city country island of Atlantis. And Citadel was the most trustworthy of all, had quarters assigned to them in the Citadel and were attached to the king's person. Finally, there were dockyards full of boats and their equipment and all in good shape. And I don't want to read, but there are 3 more pages how the political and legal authority was distributed by Poseidon to all of these sons and 5 sons who were, I think, married, and they had all these 10 provinces. So, Amber, I know you've been chatting and you've been texting, but whatever you heard, tell me how much it resembles Genesis 6, Deuteronomy 32, Divine Council. Even though it's Atlantis, and many scholars do not think this to to be, very serious. They think this was imagination of Plato. We did an episode a year ago. It took about 3 hours for us trying to assess if this was historical or not. And believe it or not, there's so many theories about Atlantis where it could be. But that's not the point. The point that I read about divine council and gods that all come from Poseidon and him sleeping with a woman, having these half breeds. How much of this is not copied, I won't say copy paste, but how much of this resembles the Bible and First Enoch?
I think that there's quite a bit of it there, but I also really was struck by how much this is reflected in Tolkien's work when he talks about where the rebellion of Ar-Pharazôn upsetting the ruling king, taking over, just causing all kinds of chaos and acting like an agent of the adversary, and to preserve and to save the rest of Arda, Eru sinks the island of Numenor as punishment. And so I think that it is reflected in Tolkien's work, that is again a reflection of this idea of the divine council and God overthrowing the rebellious, like we see in Exodus, we see it in Ezekiel and the prophets, we see it in the book of Revelation, we see it it's all over the place in scripture, this idea that God overthrows the rebellious, including the false gods of the surrounding nations.
Well, it's been a fun night. I know I said originally 2.5 hours, but then let's try 2. But I had to read so many portions, and even with skipping, dude, I had to drink so much liquids so I wouldn't be coughing. I endured, and I thank God for that, because usually I cannot read or talk that much because I'm not really of a talker. But I'm thankful we managed to do this, and I'm glad we managed to do not what not many people would even think of, connecting Moses, Plato, and Tolkien, and this beautiful, twofold story of Genesis, and then how the civilization or the population or the humankind would be structured to work along with all these entities, so-called gods, the small g gods. So I'm glad. I would also, again, invite people to go and check all these links and spend more time with it. This was done relatively fast, but it can take days and days to dissect every section. That being said, Amber, thank you so much for your strength and energy and time to endure with me for this 2 hours and almost 40 minutes. I would just invite people to keep subscribing, liking, sharing, doing those things. This is our last episode for 2024. New Year's Wednesday, right? I plan by Thursday to release a small video. It won't be live. I'll just pre-record and share online. It will be probably 10-15 minutes long, where I'll be doing recap or summary of 2024 with probably some new ideas, thoughts, maybe prayer requests, something of that sort. That being said, I would wish everyone a blessed and amazing 2025 and this year well. Please be reminded, regardless of your fall and sin and brokenness, Jesus does love you. I know this is what how some things, when they repeat it over and over again, they don't have the same effect, or they can seem so like so what? It's boring, it's dry, but it's not dry. Jesus's love is the one that sets us free, that builds us, that gives us comfort, identity, that gives us the reason and purpose to live in this life and to love others and influence them to come to Christ so they can also have life. So expect more episodes, more guests, more fun, interesting, theological, nerdy, intellectual, and hilarious moments like this in 2025 with different people and different topics, different sources. And maybe Sean, if he's watching live, maybe he can finally start his segment. I'm kindly rebuking him, right? But no, not actually. But yeah, we can expect hopefully new things in 2025, but we need your help to pray for us, but also subscribing, liking, sharing. These things don't cost you, but they mean a lot to me. They're a great encouragement for me to continue, because it's really exhausting and discouraging when I spend several days or a few days or a week preparing material with someone. I have to read books, underline. Like you saw all those documents. It took time to read and highlight all of that, to even get those
Yeah.
sources. And many times, not even 50 people watch something. And I'm not saying immediately when we go live. I'm saying in general. And I'm like, man, are people so ignorant they don't even know what is important for them? And yeah, that may sound audacious and arrogant for me, but sometimes I really don't think people know what they need. That being said, please, continue working on yourself. Please continue supporting the channel in any way you can. Ember, oh yeah, and next Sunday I'm having back Pastor Anthony Delgado. We'll be talking of his visitation to the museum where he saw 8 Dead Sea Scrolls. So we'll be analyzing all 8 of them. And the last one has to do with divine counsel, maybe God's curses, something like that that is related to Heiser. But that will be the last one. First, you have to hear about 7 so you can hear about the last one. So yeah, that will be our plan for the Sunday. Amber, your final thoughts when it comes to this vast topic we had for tonight, and any goodbye thoughts for 2024 and welcoming thoughts for 2025 for the audience. And something kind about me and the channel, please.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a lot really fast. I would say that we definitely need to step back from our presuppositions and open our minds to how much bigger and more beautiful scripture is, and that is reflected in the beauty around us. And portrayed so beautifully, poetically, and in the narrative story of scripture that when we get stuck in our narrow little box that we're in, we miss so much. So it's so important to keep expanding our minds and to keep trying to chase this love and wonder and savoring the beauty and mystery that is God's interacting with us through scripture. I would say concluding thoughts for 2024, we all made it, and 2025, hopefully wherever people are, whether it was a good year or a rough year or a struggling year, no matter what season we're in and whatever time that we're walking through, the beauty of Emmanuel, God is with us in all of those places. And so that is the hope of 2025, that no matter where it takes us, Emmanuel, that's how you pronounce it in Hebrew, is walking with us in all of it. So God is going to be there in the good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful. God is coming with us on this journey. And I have had an absolute blast since I was sent your way to this channel by Troy, and getting to interact with Sean and getting to interact with you. I've been having a blast, and it is is a bunch of weird stuff, but I love it, and I am just really enjoying it. And I recommend your channel to people on a regular basis now, especially the ones I know who like weird stuff. So yes, if you don't subscribe and watch this channel, you probably should repent, because this is a great channel, especially for weird stuff. So, but hey,
not everything is weird. We also covered solid theology. We also go to history, archaeology. Not everything is weird. Maybe you want to say we cover sometimes weird topics, but our sources are usually solid. And I mean, I don't know what you mean. It's weird. But you know what's funny? Today I was with a friend in a car, and it was a long ride to go to a restaurant to celebrate another friend's birthday from the church. And we're just talking, and I'm like, Kenny, did you know that I'm weird? And like we're laughing. I'm like, but I'm not like ashamed of that. I'm weird, but I'm different weird. I'm not like bad weird. I'm weird. I'm different than others. I have different passions. I see the world differently. I see dating and marriage differently. I see finances differently. Like I don't care about so many things. And I'm like, it's hard for me to find significant other or even close friends. He's like, true, because most people are not like me. They're like, different. They're like everyday people that you see. I'm like just different. So when you say weird, I will take it as a compliment. I will not take it as something like, I'm weird or the channel is weird. It's supposed to be weird and different, right?
Weird is a good thing. In my book, there's like a good weird, like a quirkiness that you could definitely have, and I love it. Yeah, exactly. See, he's right there. That's it.
Yeah, this is our new member of the audience. I never encountered this nickname, so thank you for following us. I don't know if you just found out about the channel, but God bless you. Thank you for the encouragement. If you didn't subscribe, please subscribe. And if you did, tell all your family and friends, wherever you, and please tell us where you're located. I would just like to know, is it based on your name that you could be in Middle East, or maybe that's your DNA, but you grew up in the West? I was just curious. Yeah. Anyway, yeah, like I said, thank you for this time, and I wish everyone in the, to have a peaceful ending of this year and to find more ways you can channel your love, passion for Christ by utilizing and be encouraged to use more of your giftings, because all of us have gifts, but sometimes we're either passive or discouraged, or someone may have told us something in the past and that prevents us, and it can be crippling to us to express our forms of art. It can be poetry, it can be making music, it can be making crafts, it can be even starting your own channel, maybe doing a ministry in any shape and form that you can influence others, bless them, and lead them. Be encouraged to pray about these things, and may God show you how He can use you in His kingdom. I'm currently not serving in my local church, but I've been doing this. So it is a form of a ministry and serving. And I always hope and pray before we go live, I pray with most of my guests and co hosts that God will use our imperfections and our topics and our minds to talk to others and bless them. It doesn't matter if they're Christians or non-Christians. So if this is inspiring to you, I praise God, because there's nothing special about me except Christ. Okay, our friend is from England. He's Jamaican family. Okay, today when I was with my friend Kenny, he's from Haiti. I know Haiti and Jamaica are not the same, but I thought that would be interesting, to know. Well, welcome on the channel. He says, "You're welcome. I've been subscribed for a short time. Topics and interesting, my kind of things. Keep it up." Thank you, man. Thank you. God bless you, brother. God bless all of you. Amber, thank you once again. I would say rest. Don't podcast anytime soon. Just enjoy your time with your family and with God. And of course, we'll be planning something for next time. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful week. Happy New Year and take care.
All right. Bye, everybody.